Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Islamic Timelines. Today we have Sheikh Amin Evans with us, and he's going to help us explore a very crucial period in Islamic history, a very crucial period in world history, a very, very crucial period in the history of the Shia. The period directly after the demise of Imam Ali alayhi salam saw Muawiyah emerge as the temporal ruler of the Islamic State. It continues with his son coming to power, his son Yazid, and we're all very familiar, obviously, with that story. But what was going on in the Islamic Empire at that time? What was happening in the cities? How did the cities evolve? How did Islamic culture evolve? How did Islamic theology evolve? It's a period often ignored very widely by the mainstream Muslim fraternity, and it's quite often ignored even by the Shia themselves. To explore in detail what was really happening, the dynamics that were going on in the newly conquered territories of Syria and Iraq, I have Sheikh Amin Evans, as I say, here to begin to unlock some of those secret histories. We're going to begin today, though, with Syria itself. The Byzantine Empire had dominated that region prior to the arrival of Islam, and the region was subsequently dominated by the rule of Muawiyah, who was installed very early during the Khulafai Rashidin period to actually govern that region. Sheikh Amin, give us a little introduction, first of all, in terms of the backdrop of the Byzantine region when the Muslims do establish themselves in that early period after the Khulafai Rashidin. What was going on? What were the dynamics? What were the key issues?
Well, there were, excuse me, there were, of course, divisions within the Muslim community, not just between the Hashemites and the Sunnites or the Umayyads, but tribal differences between North and Southern Arabs, between the tribes who felt they'd been well rewarded and tribes who felt they'd been poorly rewarded. And these set a backdrop to the development of Syria and also Iraq, but two very different countries. Iraq, Arab, as understood in the concept of the southern Arab states, while Syria more predominantly Semitic, still Arab, but a different type of Arab.
So the language in Iraq would have been Arabic at that time, predominantly?
In Iraq, Arabic. But in Syria, mainly Aramaic. And of course, Greek, Latin, Persian.
Was there a very big difference in culture?
Yes. In Syria, you have mainly Christianity coming from the Byzantines. In Iraq, many different religions are vying for dominance. Buddhists onto the banks, the eastern bank of the Tigris and Euphrates, so that a much wider mix of religions in Iraq, dominated by Christianity in Syria, and particular types of Christianity in Syria, that the Romanized church is predominant, and with the Eastern Orthodox churches, what they both have in common is the worship of saints and the reliquaries in churches. So even in the early days of Islamic history, untolerated by companions and tabi'in alike, was the marking of graves. Is a very predominantly Syrian practice at that early period. When companions die in Syria, shrines are built, large markers, and people go to them and remember them. They're doing ziyarats. In the south, the tradition of burying people wasn't so strong, because in the Bedouin tradition you didn't have graveyards. People were buried in the desert where they died, buried under the floors of houses. And of course in the Roman and Greek traditions, the dead and the living were separated. Graveyards occurred outside of city walls. And so this pattern of the graveyard of Kubristan being a separate town is very much introduced from the north. And so is the marking of the grave to remember who the person was. It didn't go to the extent of, say, the Egyptian practices, Hellenic practices, of encaustic paintings. But people knew who was buried there. And we've seen these graves have been marked up until the present day. And it's hard to see how it's justified to break them when these were practices approved by, as I said, companions, Tabi'in and Tabi'in.
So in this day and age, the desecration of the Hajr ibn Uday grave, Hazrat Hajr ibn Uday, is clearly something which is out of line with what the Sunnah, or the Sunnah, the companions and the Prophet certainly would have been, perhaps.
Well, we must remember the Imams were there witnessing this as well, peace be upon them all, so that no harm is seen in this. It's not worshipping the dead, it's remembering good men and women. And as we say, it's approved by the Salaf, of all, recognised by all schools of genuine Islam.
So that's one major expose of how Islam, when it arrives in a new cultural zone, makes its decisions about what is acceptable, what's not, what's adaptable, what's not, and it's very selective about the way it does this. So are there other examples of how, when the Muslims arrived in Damascus, let's take Damascus as the key focal point of the Syrian region of that time, what other cultural factors was Islam able to adapt with?
Well, in cultural factors, the system of marriage and property ownership are based on Roman law, Greco-Roman law, which is quite different to the Southern Arab laws. And for instance, in his book, Slavery, or the book Slavery, we see the development of a different type of slavery, moving from the domestic slavery that existed in Arabia into the chattel slavery that was Roman. And this is a clear move. And we also see changes in marriage law, because of course Roman women, although they inherited, it became the husband's property. And we tend to see this occurring more and more in Islamic relationships, that women are removed from public life and their property becomes controlled by husbands. And in a sense, they become marriage chattels, transferring wealth by means of dowry rather than mahar.
So could you define the difference between the domestic slavery and the chattel, as you put it?
Yes, one of my teachers, who I also helped with language, walked into my place one day and said, "You haven't got much food. I wish we were slaves." And he meant the traditional Arab slave, because the slave had to be fed properly, he had to be clothed, and if the slave wasn't married, it was up to his owner to find him a good wife and pay for him to get married.
So it was a responsibility of taking care of them.
Yeah, as occurs in parts of Africa today, if someone is in need, they go to a rich man and say, "Can I be your slave? Because I can't contribute as a partner. I'm not well off enough to be an employed worker. Can I just be your slave?"
This is a really important factor because people relate the slavery during the period of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and most notably Hazrat Bilal alayhi salam gets raised within this kind of context. But it's not the slavery we're talking about, which in colonial years was the slavery of the Negro in America, for instance.
In the early concept of slavery, and the one that continues in some parts of Africa, slavery is seen as a way of preserving human life, that you ally yourself to a family who have got sufficient means to support others, and for that you commit yourself to their rule. Okay, so I don't want to labour this point too much, but I want to clarify for the audience's sake as well, because it is probably a new area for most of us, analysing slavery within the period of Islam. And you've said that the chattel version, i.e. what was there within the Byzantine tradition, what was that? Now you've explained what the Arab version was, or the Islamic version of it. Well, for instance, a Roman slave was considered at a trial incapable of telling the truth unless he was tortured, and would be automatically tortured even if his evidence was corroborated by others, just to make sure he told the absolute truth. He couldn't own property, he couldn't buy his own freedom, he could be sold, his marriages weren't recognised. So he was a totally rightless person who had no right to clothing even. A completely different set of circumstances to the traditional Arab slavery. So that's a downgraded version. And are we saying that the Muslim rulers, i.e. Muawiyah primarily during that early period, adopted this chattel slavery as opposed to the original slavery that seemed to be practiced under the Prophet's period? Very much so. This became what slavery meant. So that's a violation of the Sunnah of the Prophet in a way, where he seemed to be moving towards the liberation of slaves, to the easing of their hardships and giving them rights, to a situation where Muawiyah was regressing that concept of slavery to one of ownership and perhaps even subjugation. We have to be careful in Islam, and we can see today that we are permitted to adopt what's good around us. And often what we perceive of being good is what we're used to. But also what can be seen as good is what's commercially profitable for us. And the overwhelming drive of the Umayyad dynasty, as it became, was to control the wealth of Syria and to maximise the profitability. The army of Syria was controlled by wealth and by wealthy men who kept most of the soldiers poor, most of the people poor. And so slavery was another form of wealth for them. They needed slavery for the grain production that Syria is capable of, the mining of its minerals, and for running the country. The Muslim conquerors who'd gone there had ceased to work their own fields, ceased to serve in the army. They'd become landed gentry, who, rather like Falstaff in Henry IV, you know, when he says recruiting, I'll pick all these skeletons, these walking skeletons and scarecrows, and let the rich men go if they give me some money. You're seeing exactly the same occurring amongst much of the Syrian
So this is another really important point that you've raised, that the spirit of Islam during the Prophet's period seems clearly to be violated with the one example you've given of slavery, because that attaches itself to economic self-aggrandizement. That's one clear example where you can conveniently dump or leave behind the Prophet's, the spirit of the Prophet's message, i.e. the way slaves should be treated and what should be happening in regard to that, in favour of commercial gain, when it's convenient, Muawiyah or the Umayyads seem to very quickly fall into being the traders that they were under the Abu Sufyan ideology.
Very much so. And it's a simple step, isn't it? Most people hear the word slave and they have a fixed idea of what it is. And they'll go, any sort of slave is slavery and slavery is wrong. But we can see that one type of what's known as slavery is survival, where the other is the loss of all rights. And what distinguishes between them? A simple moral judgment on the importance of the human being divides between being a beneficial and benign master and being a profit-driven, heartless person. A small moral decision, and this is what's submerged, and that loss of the moral in many things takes us away from the prophetic sunnah.
So are we talking about, I mean, I've often pondered this, every revolution seems to have a counter-revolution. If we look at the French Revolution, you look at the Chinese Revolution, perhaps even the Iranian Revolution. There always seems to be a backlash, maybe 10 years, 20 years down the line, but it is there. With the Russian Revolution, it comes in the form of Stalin, after Kamenev and Trotsky and Lenin formed the early Bolshevik revolution. There is a usurpation by Stalin and a complete metamorphosis of that revolution into something totalitarian, far probably from where Lenin would have wanted it, let alone perhaps Karl Marx. I'm now talking about the Islamic revolution of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Are we saying here we're witnessing during the period of Muawiyah, particularly, a revolution, a counter-revolution to the prophets, almost?
I would think counter-revolution
Too strong?
Is one way. I think it's not precise enough. I would compare it more to the Reformation after the glorious revolution in England, which was of course bloodless. That what occurs is a reversion to former times. Well, we could go back to the Civil War, which is bloody. And then through a series of peace processes, we evolve into the state we know Britain to be today. And so there's not really a revolution or a counter-revolution because Muawiyah is always there, that those are his values, and it's known to the Caliphs. The problem for the Hashemite party, the party of justice, is that by the time they can do anything, Muawiyah is too powerful just to say, you're not the governor of Syria anymore.
On that note, we're going to revisit this in our next program. This is the beginning of a series of programs, I think, to analyse this early period, a very important period for both people who consider themselves as belonging to one school of thought or another. All too often we don't analyse the facts and the evidence and the processes involved in the evolution of Islam. It's automatically assumed that the Islam that the Prophet, peace be upon him, established during his lifetime was in some way magically wafted to the 21st century and is exactly the way it was in his time, forgetting that there's been an evolution, quite obviously an evolution during that period. But you've done a great job in just beginning to open our eyes to some of those evolutionary processes which were clearly right at the heart of the Islamic period's early birth throes, if you like. And I think that it's an endless topic, but I'm going to come back and visit this issue of the Umayyads and Syria and the way that Islam is evolved by them or under their auspices in that period in the next program. Thank you very much, Sheikh Amin Evans. We'll join you again for part 2 of this analysis.
Thank you, Mohsin Bhai. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.